Persona 5 is a JRPG, a Japanese role-playing game. According to Destructoid, so is Child of Light, a game produced in Canada. Meanwhile, Dark Souls, a game which is very much Japanese and is also an RPG, is apparently not a JRPG. World of Warcraft and EVE Online are both often labelled as MMOs, and then there's all of these, which are all roguelikes one way or another. I don't know what to call any of these, but I suppose we could always just take a leaf from publishers' books and call them action-adventure like every single one of these. What I'm trying to say is, genre in games can get a bit weird. Gaming seems to interact with genre a little bit problematically. A huge number of games seem to fit into either too many genres or none at all. A lot of the time we need so many terms to capture what a game is that it becomes less a matter of genre and instead a list of adjectives, ways to describe a game, not categorize it. Uncomplicated genres do exist, but they're often filled with games so diverse that the genre in question doesn't feel like a meaningful category anymore. Like, all of these are open world games of a sort, but how they all design and use their open worlds is so different that putting them in the same category feels like missing the point. It seems like this sort of weirdness is a little more common in games, if only because there's a whole extra axis to genreify on, that is, gameplay. But the truth is that every medium struggles with this. Genre is a colloquial system, something consumers impose upon a diverse artistic landscape to help make sense of it. Categorizing is something we just like to do. And that's useful for discussion and analysis, but it does strip away a lot of nuance. Genre scholars seem to see this as a sort of necessary evil that should be warded against. Amy DeWitt writes, "At its worst, genre is a trivial and dangerous concept, and that it can stifle true creativity." So while the most popular and crowd-pleasing fare, your Marvels or EAs, may not be breaking every boundary in sight, the cutting edge of any medium will be populated by works that at best elude simple genreification, and at worst can be actively harmed by attempts to label them. Works which mix and match, blend styles and influences, and are more complex than a label or two can do justice to. And I think we all know this. It's a compromise we willingly make. Genre is by nature reductive, but we use it anyway because discussion and comparison becomes too onerous without it. And I found myself thinking a lot recently about how this affects the way we talk and think about games. Context and framing matter. A game doesn't change just because you call it something different, but what does change is how you approach it. We tend to judge things by the standards of what we think it is. That's why no one's unleashing hot takes on Twitter about how Titanic is an awful kaiju movie, or that Absu really fails as a tower defense game. And sure, that's pretty obvious. But the flip side is that when we do approach something with the assumption that it is something that it isn't, we can end up being unfair to it, and I think that's a trap that our instincts to categorize can lead us into. Spec Ops The Line, for example, was criticized at its launch for its lackluster gameplay. And if you treat it as a modern military shooter, which is exactly what it looks like, then, well, yeah. By those standards, its gameplay was weak and uninspired. And polished gunplay is seen as a minimum requirement for these sorts of games. But if you know Spec Ops, then you know that that game was quite consciously wearing a disguise, and was less interested in being a modern military shooter than with being an indictment of that genre. It's a psychological horror game, less Call of Duty and more Heart of Darkness. That doesn't mean it's somehow above criticism of gameplay or anything, but it does mean that that was a far less important part of the game than many players and critics assumed. Another game which fell victim to framing, much more so in fact, was No Man's Sky. I think, judging by the product we got, that it was always intended to be a low-key Zen game with an interesting gimmick. The sort of thing that was supposed to release quietly and be beloved by a small audience to whom it appealed. But instead it got swept up by Sony and thrust into the spotlight, presented as a flagship title on which no expense was being spared. But the entire time nobody seemed to be able to pin down exactly what it was. Terms like survival or exploration game or even universe simulator were thrown around, but there was no unified understanding of what they meant in the context of the game in question. In retrospect, I don't think explaining the appeal of No Man's Sky is actually that difficult. But the unclear language used to talk about it before release led to it becoming a magnet for whatever ideas and assumptions that excited fans wanted to place onto it. And the final product, though interesting, simply broke under the weight of the unfair expectations placed on it. The list of everything that went wrong with the perception and launch of No Man's Sky is an entire topic unto itself, but I do think that the inadequacies of the language we use to talk about games were partially to blame for the fiasco we ended up having. But even when genre labels feel firmer and more established, they can still mislead. Some games are simple to genreify and others aren't, and that's fine. But we do tend to have broad feelings about genres. We avoid some and seek out others. And if a genre label has been misapplied or is ill-fitting, well, there's no way to know that unless someone tells you or you take the plunge and try yourself. So I wonder how many games that people would have loved never got touched because they bounced off the genre label. Take Minecraft. There's a number of labels that would all feel appropriate for it. Sandbox, building, survival, and so on. But it isn't really any one of those things. It's a game that has a lot of ways to play, and those ways are quite different from each other. But I've met a lot of people who focused on one genre that they'd heard it was, and just assumed it wasn't for them, saying things like, "I don't like building games," or "survival games aren't my jam." Now, I don't mean to paint it out as some kind of tragically overlooked indie gem, but I think the popularity of it amongst people who've never played anything even remotely similar indicates that a lot of the people who stay away based on one of the possible genre labels might actually really love it if they gave it a shot. It's hard to know how much this thing happens because it's hard to get data on who isn't giving something a shot, but I feel like this probably happens quite often. Whether because people assume a game is something that it's not, or they don't realise that that thing is actually only a small part, our reductive language can sometimes imply that the reduced endpoint is all there is. For my own part, I know I tend to bounce off anything labelled as horror, but when I play something with horror elements, I often really like them. I've never played Dead Space, for example, because when it was popular I thought it was a horror game and therefore it wasn't for me. But I've since seen a lot to suggest that I might have dug the hell out of it, and maybe all that stopped me was that it was presented to me as horror instead of action. Something else we sometimes don't think about too deeply is what certain genre labels actually imply. Like, is FPS, or first-person shooter, a direct description of a perspective and primary verb, in which case Portal and Deadcore are probably FPS games? Or is it a wider thing that we can safely attach assumptions and tropes to, like that it's combative and involves guns or military elements? A genre can be describing a lot of things, and there's often a substantial gap between the words used and what the implications are supposed to be. This isn't unexpected. We're a young medium and we just haven't had the time to codify things or come up with the right language. But our genre labels can definitely come with some weird baggage. Take the Metroidvania genre. The genre name itself is referring to a set of design conventions and ideas found in common between the Castlevania and Metroid series, specifically Super Metroid from 1994 and Castlevania Symphony of the Night from a few years later. So, those two games were the origin of the genre, but they almost certainly weren't the origin of the ideas it's based on. Interconnected worlds with gated off areas certainly existed before those two. But the name being tied so strongly to them begs the question of how much should the genre be defined by them? Is membership to this genre about how much a game is like those two? Or were those two just really strong exemplars of a certain style, and that style is what the genre refers to? I think the latter. This isn't the first time exactly this has happened, and judging by the last times, this is the option that makes the most sense. But it can definitely muddy the waters regarding what's core to a genre and what isn't. More or less the same issue can be found with Dark Souls and the burgeoning Souls-like genre, only we're closer to the point of origination, and the genre is somehow even less clearly defined than usual. Like, I adore Dark Souls, and I adore a lot of Souls-likes, but I'm not even sure I can tell you what it means. To an even greater degree than Metroidvania, Souls-like basically has no definition except from is like Dark Souls. But Dark Souls is a lot of things, meaning there's a lot of ways to be like it. It's a landmark title that made its influence felt at every level of the game industry, from indie games right up to AAA, meaning bits of Dark Souls DNA can be found fucking everywhere. So whether or not a game is a Souls-like is often a matter of debate. Is it about difficulty, tone, world design, a stamina bar? Even Skyrim has one of those, and Sekiro doesn't. I tried Googling, and the first result gave me this helpful list of what defines a Souls-like, and I couldn't help but notice that loads of arguably Souls-like games are missing many of the things listed here, and other games that have many of these elements clearly have nothing to do with Souls. Going purely by this list, World of Warcraft is probably a Souls-like. Or was Dark Souls a World of Warcraft-like? So without anything better to go on, we're left with a nebulous definition that leaves us to decide what feels like Dark Souls. And I think that puts most of the candidates to this genre in a really uncomfortable position. That of being directly compared to one of the most seminal and influential games of the last decade. Taking games which may have taken influences from it before striking out in their own direction and then forcing them to be compared to it is basically setting them up for an unfavourable comparison. There's this implicit idea with a lot of Souls-likes that, well, it's not Souls, but I've already played Souls, so I guess this'll do. And though some games hew so closely to the Souls formula that they bring this on themselves, I think there's a lot which deserve to be taken as they are, without being held to impossible standards. And though if Dark Souls were a place I'd happily make a yearly pilgrimage to it, the enshrining of it as some sort of Star of Bethlehem for an entire, continually diversifying genre very much risks reducing analysis down to how well a game iterates on and applies the Souls formula, or more specifically the Dark Souls formula. People seem to forget that not only was Dark Souls not the first game to do almost any of the things that it did, it wasn't even the first Souls game. The deficiencies of genre frameworks are highlighted in a different way by those games which just slip through the cracks altogether. Games like Outer Wilds, Papers, Please, Undertale, or Journey. Games where there's no genre label that really sticks, except those that are so vague as to tell you nothing about what you're going to experience. And given that gaming is so much fertile design space and so strongly encourages mashing together elements of style and design, this sort of thing was completely inevitable. But to be clear, this isn't necessarily a problem. I've made multiple points about how genre labels can be misleading or set problematic expectations, and I think the refusal of some of these games to be genreified can be freeing for them. Nobody can tell you exactly what genre Outer Wilds is. And though this probably means it's harder to market and less people will play it, it also means that the people who do play it will more often go into it without expectations or preconceived notions. And that's entirely a good thing. A lot of these games are a lot more powerful when you just experience them as they are. I know some of what to expect when I play a puzzle game or a shooter, but I had next to no idea what to expect when I played Outer Wilds, and the result was one of the most surprising and powerful experiences I've ever had in this medium. And whatever problems there might be, genre as a whole isn't a bad thing either. I don't want people to start refusing to describe a game in anything less than a paragraph. I think it's obvious from the fact that I am rambling about games on the internet for no gain other than the satisfaction it brings me, that I truly love analysis and discussion of the art we consume. And categorization and genre are really important for that. There's a lot of conversations we wouldn't be able to have without these shortcuts, and those are necessary conversations which we'd be poorer without. Genre might prime us in undesirable ways or lead to bias, but it also gives us genuinely useful points of comparison for understanding what a game does well or poorly, what it's trying to do, or what its key influences might have been. It's only because we have an idea of genre that we can so easily identify how new games iterate on their inspirations and move forward. Genre might be problematically loose at times, but it does usually help more than it harms. It'd hardly have stuck around for so long otherwise. Yet, regardless of pros or cons, I think it's pretty clear that we're a bit underdeveloped in this industry when it comes to understanding how games and genre interact. At the end of the day, we're still figuring this shit out. I mean, our medium is younger than some of the people who work in it. Flash fads in literature have come and gone in the span of time that our entire medium has existed. In that sense, gaming is only barely adolescent. And I think in the years to come, as gaming matures, we're going to continue to develop more appropriate language and better understand how our medium interacts with the artistic concepts and frameworks we're familiar with. And in the meantime, however confusing things might occasionally be, no great evil is being done. I'll see you next time.